this morning, to kick things off, I am incredibly honored to bring Warren Spector to give a talk to you guys, and I have a lot I could say about him, but I want to make this short so that he can come up and talk to you guys. But when I think about people that are game designers that really embody what practice is about, Warren is one of those people that comes to mind. He started in the tabletop game industry as a teenager, I believe, or slightly older than a teenager. All right. Well, yeah. He has two teenagers inside him at that point. Warren worked making tabletop games, including the Star Wars role-playing game, and working with some of the greats in that realm. He then transitioned into digital games, and he worked at Origin Systems. He was part of Looking Glass, which was a crucible of incredibly important designers and design thinking that ended up producing things like the System Shock series and eventually the Thief series, Deus Ex, as Warren brought that team over into Ironstorm Austin, or some of that thinking into Ironstorm Austin. And he went on to found his own company after that, Junction Point Studios, and worked with Disney. And now he's making yet another life transition and becoming a full-time educator, and returning to his unfinished graduate school film degree, at least that part of his career. But for me, it's inspiring to see someone who's pursuing ideas in game design across all of these different contexts, different physical media, different forms of games, and also always interested in sharing ideas, discussing ideas, passionate advocate for thoughtful design, and a designer of really amazing, important games. Please join me in welcoming Warren Spector to Practice.
All right, thanks everyone. This is kind of early for game developers, so we'll see how this goes. It's funny, after that introduction, I'm tempted to junk everything I was going to say and just talk about how I've spent my entire career, all 30 years of it, trying to recreate the experience I had playing Dungeons & Dragons in the 70s, where we all told stories together instead of listening to someone tell us a story or experiencing someone telling us a story. And that is, in fact, largely what I'm going to talk about today. The title up there doesn't say it all, or I wouldn't have anything to say for the rest of the hour. But before we start, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, you'll notice there is an incredibly different email address for me than any of you have ever seen before. I am taking a little hiatus. I hope it's a short one until I get back to making games on the side, but I'm taking a hiatus to actually build a game development program at the University of Texas, post-baccalaureate degree. So anybody who gets out of the NYU program, which is so wonderful, who would like to continue their education and focus on the soft skills of leadership in game development, I would be happy to talk to you about that. Okay, so the other, the one apologia here is we couldn't get the aspect ratio right on this projector, and so everything's going to be squished. Luckily, the organizers of this conference asked me to give a talk to advanced design students, or an advanced design topic, and I could not think of a way to make it pretty. So it's a very old school, yawning, bullet points, lots of words sort of talk. So aspect ratio becomes somewhat less important. But I apologize for the aspect ratio and for the lack of beautiful pictures in this talk. Okay, so getting started. First of all, a note about terminology. I am going to confuse all of these terms at some point in this talk. Take them as meaning exactly the same thing, even though there are subtle differences. Take them as meaning the same thing when I get this wrong. Similarly, when I talk about the opposite sort of approach to game design and development, all of these words are going to mean the same thing today too. Okay, so don't worry about it. It'll all be okay. We'll just assume they mean the same thing. Okay. So to get started, I don't know about you, but when I take a trip to the software store or video game outlet or online, digital distribution network, There are times when I'm feeling cynical and I see shelf after shelf, whether it's real or virtual, of games that are kind of, I characterize as Me Too product. Sequels, licensed games based on movies, TV shows, sports simulations. There are indie games that sometimes look like portfolio pieces for people who really want to be working at Electronic Arts. Mobile games that rip off other mobile games that rip off other mobile games. But when I look past that, and I remember, the hoary old cliche about everything sucking, there's something else you can notice. Current game development is not quite so bleak an environment, and there really is an awful lot of creative risk-taking going on right now. And there are people who are trying to make games free of constraints of other media or inspiration from other media to forms of entertainment that we want to be breaking free from, not being beholden to. So in this sea of Me Too product, you see games like this, some of them old, some of them new. And I'm not going to read this off, and if I'd been really smart, I would have had pictures of all of these boxes and all that. But, that's a pretty diverse set of games. And you might ask, what could they possibly have in common? And what I would say they have in common, look, everybody's staring at it. I'll let it go for another beat. Okay. I would argue that what unites all of those games, despite their very different genres, very different surface level approaches, is they all exploit the power of emergent gameplay. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the two major types of games that I see in my oversimplifying way, given that I have 40 minutes. There are two categories of games I see. One is tightly scripted, linear games, often adventure games. Games like Heavy Rain and Walking Dead and Bioshock Infinite, Beyond Two Souls, The Last of Us, Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, Gears of War. There are lots and lots of games that I would argue are tightly scripted adventures, which we will talk some about today. And then the other category of games in my oversimplified universe is games that are driven by players, where the story, the narrative, the experience is driven by players. God, this is an intimidating front row. Holy cow. Anyway, those are games that I'm playing, like Deus Ex, Human Revolution, spiritual successor and actual successor, I guess, to Deus Ex. It's not a spiritual successor. There it is. It's right out there for all the world to see. Dishonored, which I'm proud to say was made by Harvey Smith and about half of my old team carrying the flag for us. I'm playing Papers, Please and Versu. Heck, you can throw Tetris in there if you want. I want to focus on games mostly like this today that put players in control of the experience. Now, there is a caveat here. I often come across as someone who says, wow, games like Heavy Rain suck. And I don't believe that, okay? I thought Walking Dead and Heavy Rain were, as a player, the best experiences I had a couple of years ago. I absolutely adore those games as experiences, but I'm not saying that games like that are bad and games of emergence are good. So please, nobody tweet that I said Heavy Rain sucks, okay? It's just, the thing is, for people who are overwhelmed and tired and maybe even scared about the world they live in, which at some points probably describes all of us, games that don't offer what I'll call in air quotes real choices might be just fine, okay? I mean, games that require people to think and apply some sort of ethical layer to their decision making. They require skill and judgment to make forward progress. Games that don't require that may be just what the doctor ordered. Some people may want a game that's all about squeezing a virtual trigger or moving forward like a shark or solving a puzzle that shows more about how clever the designer is than about how clever they are. But I'm just more interested in a different kind of game, as a developer especially, games that do offer real choice, as I describe it, and real consequences. I believe that once players get a taste of that kind of game, it's very hard for them to go back. So I'm going to try to convince you of that today. Okay, so what is this talk about? I want to start by talking a little bit about what is emergence, so we all have a sort of a shared baseline of understanding. I want to talk about how we achieve emergence in games, which is going to be the really hard part to do in the half hour I have left. There's a 0% chance I'm getting done in half an hour, by the way. Okay. I want to talk about problems that emergence causes, because it's not all good stuff. There are lots of problems that you'll encounter. I want to talk about why developers and players should care about this, at least try to make the case that they should. I want to talk about the potential inherent in this kind of gameplay, in this kind of game. And I want to talk about where this might lead us. I did tell you there were lots of words in bullet list, didn't I? Yeah, okay. Here's the first squeezed image. That's not too bad. The concept of emergence is nothing new. I mean, I first encountered it probably late in the game, as it were, in the 1990s. This was a book from 1994 where the author, Murray Gell-Mann, who I'm probably mispronouncing, described, he said, complex structures or behaviors arise from interactions among systems of simple rules. That's a pretty good start at a definition. And it can be fleshed out, obviously. Another terrific book from 1998 called Emergence. John Holland says, the hallmark of emergence is a sense of much coming from little. He goes on to say that getting more out of a machine, it's getting more out of a machine than you put in. And then he proposes a small set of well-chosen building blocks, constrained by simple rules, can generate unbounded streams of complex patterns. Okay, that's a nice addition to the definition. And he goes on to say, oh my God, don't even try reading this. He goes on to say that emergence involves the creation of a program that is fully reducible. Those are keywords, fully reducible to rules, the application of which results in unanticipated behaviors. And then this summary just blows my mind. I mean, this was a counterintuitive revolution when I saw this. The program is fully capable of surprising its programmer. Okay, just think about that. Rules-based surprise. That is the kind of the crux of the biscuit for me. But it's counterintuitive. I mean, he does talk about, I don't have enough time. I'm going to go through this. The one thing that's important on this slide is the ever-changing flux of patterns leads to perpetual novelty. And when I think about games, games as games, not games as imitations of some other medium, I think of games as engines of perpetual novelty. If we could all hold on to that, think what a different world we would live in. Okay, so does it apply to games? Well, it certainly applies to games when I talk to my friends and colleagues. Harvey Smith, who's the lead designer, he was the lead designer on Deus Ex. He was the project director on Deus Ex Invisible War. He was the co-director of Dishonored. He's talked about a future in which emergence represents a new paradigm. It's not simply a refinement of what's gone before. It's something entirely new. Okay, and this is a great quote. Games of the future will rely heavily on high-fidelity world representations. High-fidelity world representations that will allow for more emergent behavior and unforeseen player interactions. Another great summary of what we're going to talk about here. Randy Smith, who was the designer on Thief and Thief 2, project director on Thief Deadly Shadows. More recently, he's part of an indie effort called Tiger Style, which did Spider and Waking Mars, which you may be familiar with. He cites emergence as a critical element in future games. The appeal is a less pre-scripted agenda on the part of the developer. This perception on the part of players, and in some cases, I think even the reality that anything can happen, because the dev team indirectly authors play experience. We'll talk a lot more about that today, too. You set up general case interactions and allow players to share in the process of creating a story. Shared authorship, critical term for me and for all of us. And of course, Doug Church, project director on the Underworld games and System Shock, and guy I've consulted with on every project I think I've ever done. He identified emergence as one way we can address risks associated with ever larger, ever more complex games. Clearly a firm believer in the future of procedurally generated narrative, which is something that I hope I can explore in the future as well. But he says player-directed interaction is our goal. Emergence empowers player choice. You can hear this coming back again and again and again. And complexity and scale leads to costs and risks, which we can mitigate to some extent by moving to a more systemic approach to design. But now you may be thinking, okay, this is just Warren and his buddies over beers saying, yeah, this is cool, we're smarter than everybody else. But I don't think that's true. I learned a lot of this from Richard Garriott when I started at Origin Systems, which I'll come back to in a little while. But the guys at BioWare certainly picked up on this. I mean, Knights of Legend, sorry, an old Origin game. Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect. I think they show the influence of this move towards emergent gameplay. The folks at Rockstar certainly get it, although they execute it in a different way. Bethesda certainly gets it, again, executing in a different way than I would. And back in the day, before they went out of business, which probably isn't the best case I could make for this approach, but Lionhead and Maxis, tried to apply some of this thinking as well. And nowadays, I mean, a host of indie guys are doing it, which is awesome. So sure, this applies to games. I mean, simple rules, flexible object implementation. I want to talk about each of these in turn with regards to games. So simple rules, well, okay, I think Eric would agree. Oh, he looks up at that point. Eric would agree that, I mean, without rules, we have no games, right? I mean, games are rules-based systems, fundamentally. So rules-based interaction, we got that. Rules manipulated by players, well, okay, without rules, or without players, our rules and objects have no meaning. I mean, without player manipulation, there's no state change. Without a state change, there's no anything. We have a static screen or a bad TV show. Objects allow dynamic interactions. Well, okay, we've got no shortage of objects, code objects, in-game virtual objects. We've got games that have cups and chairs and weapons and geometry and characters and monsters. We have objects. Sadly, I think most games allow very limited, largely non-dynamic interactions with those objects. But we could allow dynamic interactions among objects if we chose to. And then, yeah, okay, however limited the interactions may be, I mean, if we let you interact with this microphone, which most of the time we don't, or these batteries, which most of the time we don't, or whatever this thing is here, which I don't know what that is. Anyway, when we do allow you to interact with something, those interactions with objects are driven by players, obviously. And then player choices. Okay, again, without player interaction, nothing happens in a game. You can walk away from a TV show pretty confident that it's going to go on without you while you take your bathroom break, right? And a book, when you put a book down, the words aren't going to rearrange themselves. Wow, it'd be really cool if they did, though, now that I think about it. We could probably do that now, gee whiz. Anyway, the words aren't going to rearrange themselves or fade away, right? But in a game, nothing happens if the player doesn't do anything. Now, the real key is player choices result in novel situations. I would argue that most games do that very badly. Lots of people have built careers around allowing very limited interactions with static objects, which I think kind of reduces players to semi-intelligent button pushers, just to be a little judgmental. But we can offer players flexibility and the opportunity to interact with objects in ways that result in novel situations. And at our best, when we put these admittedly still vague ideas together, rules, objects, choices, consequences, all of that stuff, novel situations, when we do that, the result is a game that plays out differently every time it's played. Every player has a unique experience. Every player who plays more than once, which is actually possible, useful, and potentially fun, this all allows, emergent gameplay allows that and makes it both possible and desirable. So we've got a real possibility of doing something very interesting. Okay, so that's about all I want to say about emergence and what it is and how I think it relates to games. Now I want to sort of move into how we make it happen. In fact, oddly enough, a few years ago, I gave a talk at NYU, not in this room, but in another much smaller room, a more intimate room, where I talked about our medium's need to exploit its unique characteristics and to move beyond adopting characteristics of other established media, right? What I started saying today. Obviously, emergent gameplay is critical to that, but in that earlier talk, this was kind of the core message of that talk. That the future of game design is not tied to looking backwards. It's tied to looking forward and doing what we do that no other medium can do. And I would argue that this idea of emergence, the idea of player-driven experiences, is the one thing. It is the only thing, I think. You can argue with me in our Q&A session should we have time for such a thing. But I think it is the only thing that sets us apart in any meaningful way from other media. And so I think we have a moral obligation to enlist players as collaborators in the telling of a story. We have to tell stories or allow the telling of stories that are as much players as they are ours. Okay. So in my world, this is Randy Smith again, and that phrase, to what extent the designer is able to predict the player's experiences, that's going to come back again and again here. I don't know why I picked a picture of him eating a banana. I didn't notice that banana until just now. But in my world, and I hope yours after this talk, total predictability is a bad thing. Anything that happens to all players every time makes a game more linear, less interactive, I'd argue less interesting. So we need new ways of thinking. And then the first new way of thinking, the new question I think to ask yourself, if you're not already asking this, is can you predict precisely what will happen to your players? If the answer is yes, and you can all think of games where this is possible, okay, so I'm not going to name any. There are a couple places where I'm going to get myself in a lot of trouble by naming names, but this is not one of them. If the answer is yes to that question, can you predict the player's experience, you may want to rethink. When you play a game or work on a design, ask yourself if NPCs always respond to the same input in the same way, at the same time. We've all played games where you step on an invisible trigger, and every single time a tentacle monster crashes through a window, okay? Or you reach an invisible trigger in a room and dogs burst through the windows and scare you to death. That has two effects, I think. The first one is it scares the crap out of you the first time, and it bores you to death the next time. And usually it kills you, which turns a game into a fail, learn, retry. Usually fail, learn, retry until you figure out the way to get past it. I think those are exercises in shock and frustration, and we want to move away from that as far as I'm concerned. If you're, as a designer who thinks that way, yes, you are delivering emotional, jump out of your seat moments. You may even be able to make a player cry because, you know exactly what they're going to do. But I would argue you're not sharing the spotlight sufficiently with your player. And okay, here's a test case. How many people remember either of those games? Oh, you are all game students. Okay, awesome. Okay, in this example, in Star Fox, by the way, I could have used Metal Gear Solid versus Deus Ex too, but I didn't want to be that self-serving. Although I may actually. No, anyway, okay. In Star Fox, the only thing the designers don't know is how much ammunition you have left and how many hit points you've got. Other than that, they know everything. They can tune that experience within an inch of its life. But fundamentally, every player is going to have exactly the same experience. When you're playing that old classic, I mean that, by the way, no attitude, X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, the designer works in a very different way, not creating a path, not creating the same challenges for every player, but saying, okay, your job is to do X, blow up that Imperial shuttle, and then get into hyperspace before the Y-wings come after you or can destroy you. That's all the designer needs to know, and that is it's an approach that's applied widely in sports games. It's applied widely in flight simulator with combat flight simulators. We can apply that same thinking to other kinds of games as well. Okay. Why did that not go? Okay, so let's build on that thought and look at the games on this slide. You could argue that the games on the right side of the verses there offered more interesting stories than the games on the left. You could make that case, okay? The designers of those right-hand games knew absolutely everything that every player was going to do every step of the game, except what weapon they were going to use and whether they were going to take the pre-planned right path or left path. Mr. shaking his head no. Okay? They know, other than player weapons, ammunition, hit points, and pre-planned path, there are no variables in those games on the right. I mean, it's just, okay, I'll stop there because I'm going to get myself in trouble already. But when you know everything your player is going to do, of course you can craft a storyline that makes sense. Of course you can put your camera in exactly the right place when you step on that invisible trigger or that monster shows up the same every time. It's a linear, creator-centered medium for those games, okay? Now let's look at the games on the left-hand side. Those were games that I reveled is not too strong a word. They reveled in what the designers didn't and couldn't know about each player's unique approach to more general situations. Again, it's not that the games on the left are good and the games on the right are bad, okay? It's not that. Please. I mean, frankly, it's likely that the games on the right outsold the games on the left by substantial margins, to be clear. Again, really making my case for all of you adopting this approach. But the games on the left sacrificed some emotional content and some sort of traditional story content for a story that belonged uniquely to each person who played the game. They're more gamey and not in the sense of meat, okay? They're more game-like. So those left-hand games, what they did is they gave players the tools to create and discover, certainly, but even to create gameplay, rather than tools to reveal the designer's intentions. You know, you're not that smart, designers. Okay, players are smart. And if you're thinking this is a direction you want to go, you have to stop thinking about providing specific, repeatable problems for players and start providing a context in which players act. A context. And I will talk more about all this stuff, by the way. You have to embrace this idea that your job is to bound the player experience, to put sort of a creative box around it, is the way I usually describe it. But you don't determine the player experience. It's not about here's where every player does X. It's like in the first Tomb Raider game, I'll never forget, there's a moment where you almost make a leap across the chasm and your fingers just grab on by the edge, and then you look up and there's a Tyrannosaurus Rex there and you pull out your pistol and every player describes exactly the same situation. How's that a game? Why would I care about that? Okay, you want to bound the player experience. There's a chasm. You see a dinosaur. How do you deal with it? Not every player describes the same jump across the chasm, right? We certainly tried to do that in Deus Ex, in squashed Deus Ex. We wanted players to determine how they wanted to interact with the problems we set up. Our core idea was built around the idea that we didn't want to force players to play the way we wanted them to. We wanted them to decide how to play our game. We didn't want to have to care. Notice I didn't say we didn't care. We didn't even want to have to care about whether they fought or sneaked or talked their way past any of those problems. The way, frankly, the games on the right do want to worry about that, and they do a very good job of worrying about that. We wanted players to make their own plans and see what happens when they try to execute those plans. We wanted players to experiment. I mean, what kind of no, I'm not going to say that. I was going to start dissing on other games, and I don't want to do that. We wanted in a positive way for players to experiment with our game worlds. Try different kinds of behaviors. I mean, try things that in our game world that we don't want you trying in the real world. I mean, God, I love dogs. I don't want anybody shooting a dog, But in Deus Ex, you can do that. And frankly, my wife did when we were in beta. She accidentally shot a dog, and to this day, she has never finished the game because that affected her so powerfully. I'm not proud of the fact that she's never finished the game, and she's a gamer, too. But anyway, what we wanted them to do was figure out who they wanted to be in the context of our game world and in the context of our high-level story arc, which we did own. Okay, and we gave them a game world that supported those choices. All of these are critical. I mean, multiple solutions are only good if they allow you to experiment. The experiment is only good if the game world actually feeds back to you what happened and what the result of your choice was. That notion, thankfully, has been embraced in all sorts of games ever since. Okay, so we and others embraced this idea that, not to be too judgmental here, the most interesting games of all are those that let players devise personally meaningful goals, formulate and execute plans to achieve those goals using the information and resources provided by the game. Okay, and here's of those three things, this is the most important one. The plan must be devised by the player. Okay, it's not about how clever you are. I'm going to say that over and over and over again. If all you're doing is solving a puzzle, you have just shown how clever the designer was. And maybe you feel a sense of triumph because you beat the designer. But you haven't shown much about who you are as a human being. And games of emergence can allow you to express who you are, not who your avatar might be. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about not just ways of thinking, but ways of doing. Are you really going to cut me off at 10:30?
We started late, so it's
Okay, all right. Let's talk about some of the details. There are methodological differences necessary to share authorship, okay? And methodological differences required to bound player experience, not determine it. So let's talk about how the heck you design a level, frankly, under such constraints. Okay, so the old-fashioned way, and this I'm kind of stealing this from Harvey Smith again, who's one of my colleagues. He described it as he calls it special case design. I call it emulation typically. So the first thing the team does in making this old school kind of game, not the new school kind of game that I'm talking about, the team determines the fictional setting of a mission, the overall look and feel, the general placement of resources like weapons and tools and things like that, where do AIs go, friends, enemies, neutrals, what weapons are going to be available, as well as the kinds of puzzles and problems. But here's where things go a little weird for me. Then a designer or a bunch of designers go off and get into the specifics of implementation. Sometimes they work with artists, sometimes with programmers, but fundamentally, once the sort of high-level goals of a mission are set, this little design cabal, or individual designer in some cases, goes off with his or their individual tastes, individual working methods, individual strengths and weaknesses, and they create the mission. Everything in a mission is created on a per instance basis. So objects are designed to operate individually and uniquely. Every door is hand-coded. Every elevator is hand-coded. Invisible triggers set off those amazing NPC behaviors I was describing. It is astonishing to me that anybody still makes games this way. And yet, you guys are probably too smart to do this. But I'm telling you right now, I know lots of developers who are off making games just like this every day, where every single interaction is hand-coded individually and uniquely. The key question, what am I going to make my player do now? You know, even when they offer choices, those choices are all pre-planned. Okay, the paths, the choices, the options, those amazing ethical decisions, they're all pre-planned. If they're not pre-planned, they don't happen. Okay, the designer's job is to set up diabolical situations. You know, that is the way a game. If you remember Eco, anybody remember Eco? Loved that game. Oh my God. It was one of the best executed versions of this approach to design I can describe. Walking Dead, Heavy Rain, those are games that are designed like this. All of the interactions are individually scripted. And as much as I loved all those games, it's massively inefficient to build a game like that. I mean, oh my God, the effort it takes, and holding all of those thoughts in your head. Eric, pay attention. I just like giving you a hard time. I'm sorry. It's because you're there. I appreciate that. But think about this: every player at some point tries something that the designer didn't think of, and what happens then is you're dragged out of the experience. I mean, it's just unbelievable. You're not playing the game; you're playing the designer. Okay, and that results in frustrated players, inevitably. It doesn't matter how well crafted a game is. I don't want to do that, damn it. Comes up at least, well, a lot. Okay, it comes up all the time. And it's usually frustrating in some very specific ways. There's some arbitrary force that foils the player. No, you can't open that door. No, that door is blow-upable, but that one is not. Okay, some arbitrary force foils the player. And then, I mean, look, does anybody remember No One Lives Forever? Game No One Lives Forever? Okay, people love that game, right? It was very strange to me when I played it because it seemed clear to me that the team was kind of inspired by Deus Ex. It came out like some months afterwards, and even some people on the team admitted that they were a little influenced, but they tried to hard code all the things that we simulated. And so there were things like, there was one mission where you had to use the spear gun to kill a shark. And there were sharks throughout the game, and you had the spear gun throughout the game, but in no other mission could you kill sharks with a spear gun. It was only in the mission where your job was to kill the shark with the spear gun. Talk about frustrating, at least to me, okay? And then, not to give Nolf too hard a time, there was another mission where your job was to turn off an alarm system. You had to get to a specific place, flip a giant lever, because all alarm systems are run with giant levers, you know. And in no other mission could you turn off the alarms. I mean, that just makes no sense to me. It's because every level, every mission was hand-coded by probably a different designer, and they weren't talking to each other. And even if they were talking to each other, there still would have been frustrating inconsistencies in those worlds, okay? And then just, I mean, is there any way to get creative, to try things that were not pre-planned in BioShock Infinite? Can anybody think of a single thing you could do that every other player didn't do? Right. Beyond Two Souls, anybody think of any experiment you could try in those games? I just can't. And it has nothing to do with whether they're good games or bad games. I would describe them as great experiences more than great games. But you just kind of have to pick up the biggest gun and go, or go down the path that the amazingly, and I mean that seriously with no attitude, an amazingly smart designer wanted you to go. And if you fail, you just have to reload and execute the right solution to keep making progress. That's all you can do. And I personally find that a source of immense frustration. And in a game like this, in a special cased, emulated, whatever word you want to use, game, when the unexpected happens, it's always a bug. It's a what the hell moment. It's never a good thing, okay? So in this traditional model, just to give you a few more examples, what happens when there are fire arrows that are hand-coded to set torches on fire. Well, what happens when you fire a torch at something other than, fire a fire arrow at something other than a torch? What happens when you step on a stone tile and it doesn't make a noise, but when you step on a metal tile, a metal floor piece, it does? What happens when you swing a sword designed to kill non-human enemies with a single blow and you try it against a human enemy? What happens? Well, typically, nothing happens, okay? Or something illogical happens. And players instantly sucked out of your game. They just have no idea what's going on. They're reminded they're playing a game. Now, there are good things and bad things about emulation and scripting and hard coding. You always get exactly the behavior you want as a designer. So if what you want to do is tell your story, go, go, go. Okay, I'm not sure why you're not making a movie or writing a book, but go, have fun, Players are very comfortable with that. They don't have to think much. They just have to keep moving forward like a shark, and eventually they'll mash buttons in the right way or pick up exactly the right walkthrough, which tells them exactly the one thing they have to do here. And they'll get through your game. No real possibility of failure, ultimately, okay? That's a good thing for some people some of the time. The bad, it takes a long time to set up 1,000 doors individually. Players get frustrated, like I've said before. And when you find a bug or more to the point, if you decide you want your doors to behave differently, oh wait, instead of moving, opening inward, we want them moving and opening outward, or we want all our doors to do crushing damage. If you're standing in a doorway, you have to touch every single one individually. And you're probably sitting there thinking, I'm full of it, and nobody does games this way, but trust me, they do, okay? So I think this is a good approach for a simple game, a small scale game, but it doesn't scale well, and it will frustrate your players. Ultimately, you're going to frustrate your players somewhere. Okay, so here again, going back to Harvey, this is the way he described planning for the future. You still do all the same stuff. You start out doing the same things. So I'm not going to rehash that. This is regardless of your design philosophy, your implementation strategy, whatever. But now you plan, instead of specifics, you plan types of interactions. There might not be, your damage model might not be, I have this character has 10 hit points, this character has 100 hit points, and this sword does D20 damage, random secret die rolls, because God knows we don't have any better way of simulating real world behaviors than what Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson came up with in 1974. Okay, anyway. The sarcasm apparently does not work on this audience in the morning. But you might have swords do pointy damage. Boink, boink, boink. Okay, let's see. I thought, anyway. Or slashy damage. Thanks, I'm trying to get a rise out of people. Okay. Hey, they said they wanted an in-depth talk. I'm trying. Things might do explosive damage. You might introduce the concept of heat that melts things or makes things uncomfortable so they leave the area, or cooling and freezing, wetting, crushing, so on. I mean, you devise types of interactions, okay? And then you build systems. You define game objects that have globally defined characteristics that respond to those systems I was just describing, right? Your water in your game knows how to respond. All water, anywhere in your game, whether it's a pond, a river, a stream, a glass, responds to heat damage. I mean, what would happen if you applied heat to water? We all know, right? What happens if you apply cold to water? We all know. Individual objects are defined with certain universal characteristics, right? Then, like I said, you craft systems that define behaviors and interactions globally, not individually, not uniquely. So here's the key question that arises from that approach. Is where will players express themselves? What do I need to define? What characteristics of objects and what systems do I have to create to interact with those objects that players can express themselves and experiment themselves with the things the world makes possible? Okay. So instead of focusing on specific reactions, you create global rules. Remember, we talked about global rules before as part of the key to emergence. Well, instead of specific instance behaviors of objects, and characters and everything else, we can focus on the creation of consistent universal rules, okay? We can create those interlocking systems. I mean, what happens when a fire arrow, well, flame damage and a torch and a guard who responds to light, when that all gets together, there's nothing pre-planned about that, but there is an interlocking system that players can interact with that's really powerful. Okay, and that interaction is not determined by the player, by the designer. It is determined by the player, okay? What you want is systems and rules that work together to create consistent, predictable, but not predetermined, in predictable, consistent, but not predetermined ways, okay? Hard coding, predetermined is what you're looking for. I'm going to skip past this. I mean, if anybody who knows, what? Yeah, well, I'm about 2/3 of the way through my talk, so I'll be done in an hour or so. Okay, I'm gonna skip through it. I will. Yeah. Try it, buddy. We'll do a dance battle. Okay, I'm skipping. I'm going. I'm scared of you, man. Okay. Skip. Okay, try applying. Hey, we can always talk later. Try applying the same approach that you all take to, we do object-oriented programming. Why not do object-oriented design, okay? That's the one-sentence summary of about 12 slides. Okay, anyway. Yeah, okay, so what we get is, from this approach, which I've always sort of semi-described in very vague ways, is a consistency of cause and effect that I find really powerful, unpredictable logical outcomes. And then the wild card, the thing that makes it all come together is player action, using things in interesting ways. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. I'm skipping over this because I already talked about it enough. I do want to talk about crates. Okay, because crates are important. There was, back when Deus Ex came out in 2000, I can't remember what website it was. I wish I could. A website did Old Memory, that's right. Oh my God, I haven't thought about that in years. They did a contest to see, which game had crates earliest, and Deus Ex won because we had a crate before the game even started. Okay? But in a sort of a hard-coded, emulated world, if there's a pressure plate and you see 3 crates, what you have to do is pile the crates, find a way to maneuver the crates onto the pressure plate, right? What I would much rather do is say that pressure plate requires a certain amount of pressure, and it doesn't matter how you apply that pressure, right? It could be you standing on it with a vase and a tomato. I don't care, right? Why do we care how you solve that problem? And yet, most games, I think, even to this day, care how you solve the problem, not that you solve the problem. Water. Okay, I've already kind of talked about this too, but emulated water can have all of these specific effects. But how much more powerful is it if you don't pre-plan them? If you just say water, I didn't even put it in here. Water, what happens when water touches paper? We can just simulate all of those things and other things. And then what happens when a player, wants to destroy a plot that the bad guys are trying to hatch? And what he does is he tosses a water balloon onto a desk where there are the plans, the map is being looked at. We don't have to pre-plan all that kind of stuff. All we have to do is make water be water, for crying out loud. Okay. The goodness about Sims is that game elements behave consistently. Players can intuit behaviors. Okay, so for example, if an NPC drops a torch and it accidentally hits a rat, just by accident, it's, you can probably intuit that if you threw a torch at a dog, it would burn the dog too, and the dog would run away. I mean, you can make a plan and execute it, intuiting from another experience you've had in the game world, pretty much like the real world. And we can do this. It's not that hard. So players can make plans that will probably succeed, but not necessarily. And when those plans fail, it will be a failure of their planning or their execution, not a failure of the game to support their choice. How much more powerful is that? The badness is you got to define all of your object properties and determine your game systems and the interactions between them early enough that you can actually do it. A lot. I was going to curse because it's a really big lot. You can do a lot of testing early, okay? You need artwork and sound to support all of the things that you make possible. That is probably the single biggest problem. And if I had an answer for how to solve that, I would rule the world, frankly. And I don't know if I'd be giving this talk right now because I'd be ruling the world. So you have to think through the ramifications of what you do choose to simulate. I don't want to overstate this, but we can certainly do better than any designer can do pre-planning things in advance. You need to get I already said you need to get things into test really early because there will be unpredictable results. I'll talk about some of those very, very briefly in a few minutes. And you need to use metrics. I mean, I'm by nature I hate metrics and testing of this sort, but you really do need to build tools into your game to determine how people are interacting with your simulation. You can't watch enough games to know how people are really interacting. Okay, and the big badness is players will break your game. I mean, they just will. Just so get ready for it. What qualifies as a game breakage and a bug for a lot of people is a feature for me. There you go. And feedback's out there. Make sure you're telling people what's going on. I can really get through this, Eric, I promise. The bad stuff about simulation is that it requires players to think. I mean, you have to think, and making a plan is hard. When we watch people play Deus Ex back when we started testing it in 98, 99, we came up with the term paralyzed by choice. Games are the most interactive medium on the planet, and yet when we watch people play our game in the first 5 minutes, we set up obvious choice points early in the game, and we would see people stop and just like step back from the keyboard and the mouse, which will tell you how long ago this was. And they oh my God, I have to make a real choice? It's like it's up to me? No, games had not offered that sufficiently before. Okay, forget that. Okay. We've already talked about all of this stuff. Sorry. I see, look at me, I'm being really good. Development methods have to change. And by the way, if you think I'm full of it, you're just wrong. No, I've hired a lot of producers, really exceptionally good, very experienced producers over the last 30 years. And every one of them comes in saying, oh yeah, what you do is different, sure. What you do is harder, yeah, whatever. I'm just going to apply some standard waterfall methods to this, or Scrum and Agile, we'll just solve all the problems. And a year later, they all come back to me and go, you were right, which is always gratifying for me. So is it all worth the risk? Well, I think you can start looking at games that are using this approach. I mean, Grand Theft Auto and many at Skyrim and others. Players are voting with their dollars for games like this. So I think box office success is there. Believe it or not, your content generation really does become easier in a lot of ways. Not in all ways, but a lot of ways. game tuning and bug fixing, when you just have to change one property of the door archetype and all of your doors magically change to the behavior you want, trust me, you're going to be a really happy developer. Replayability, I've got a friend who is not a gamer, and he played through Deus Ex 7 times. I also know someone who played it through 63, and I'm glad they don't live on this continent. And you get more playtime. I mean, the fact that you can play through Deus Ex 7 times and still have fun and have a different experience every time means there's a lot more bang for your buck than in a game like Heavy Rain. As much as I loved it, I'm never playing it again. Maybe once. Maybe I'll play it through one more time. See if I can save it. Anyway. Okay, there's an easier learning curve because you can apply real-world common sense. How can this not be the wave of the future? Which I think supports a broader range of players, okay? In terms of games as art, they become more game-like as we give players more control over their experience. Because your AI has to respond to a broader range of possibilities, it forces us to think about AI as something more than just a thing that is supposed to kill the player, which I think is really important for our future. There's a larger possibility space, clearly. And as our environments become richer looking, they're not becoming any more interactive. And I think with this approach, our level of interactivity matches, or at least comes close to matching our environment. Okay, no examples. We'll talk more later. Yeah, okay. Games are good. Simulated games are better. And thank you. That was so unfair of me to craft that long a talk.
Thanks. No, that's all right. No, you can. Now that I've. All right. So thank you, Warren, very much. Now, the one thing I want to say to sort of kick off discussion here is that on the planet where I live, which is, I think, partially where we all are now here at Practice, the highest form of respect is thoughtful criticism and constructive debate. And so I just want to say that we are, in a sense, the inspiring thing about the dance battle last night is I love the way that they talked about all being a family and being together, but at the same time, nice. I guess we know who won this face-off. That they're all a family, but yet they also compete with each other in a spirit of competition. Everyone in this room wants the same thing, right? We want to make games better. So I just want to open it up, and I really hope that this feels like a safe space where people can ask very direct and pointed questions in the spirit of debate. So I'm just going to kick it off with a quick question for you, Warren. I think this was a great, interesting talk, and for me, it sits right at the pivot point of maybe one of the most fascinating debates going on in game design today. Because what you described, it's true that 10 or 15 years ago, this whole idea of emergence really came to the fore. The people that you mentioned, Marc LeBlanc, doing work with mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, and the whole idea was, let's step away as designers and give players agency. What's interesting now, and I'd like you to comment on this, is that we're seeing in indie games, and I know at the Queer Games conference that happened very recently, there's an interesting counter movement, which is saying that it's important for designers to express their points of view and to put those unique and quirky and independent and let's say alternative or underprivileged voices out into the world. And that it's in an interesting way, we saw player voices. We saw. Just let me finish my question. My friend Warren. We saw player agency as being something that we wanted to encourage as empowering. But there's an idea of empowering designers in order to tell more human stories. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Could you repeat your question? I've forgotten it. No. Okay. Yeah. No. That's a great. I can't do it. I'll freeze in that position. Yeah, that is a great question. And there are a couple of answers. First of all, I've said this before. I will say it again. I'm sure 1,000 times before I die. The coolest thing about what's happening in games right now is that everything is happening in games. There was a point where that 10, 15 years ago, there really weren't a lot. There wasn't a lot of variety in the types of games that were being made or played. I don't think nearly the variety we have now. And so I think there's room at both ends of the spectrum. I should really be holding this up, shouldn't I? There's room at both ends of the spectrum for a very clear, specific message coming from a designer and being communicated to players. And I think.
Not according to your talk.
No, I said repeatedly that it's not that one kind of game is good and one kind of game is bad. I said I'm more interested in one kind of game than I am in others. As a developer, as a player, I love the fact that every once in a while I can get in the head of another designer. I can see what's going on with them, and I can have the same kind of aesthetic and intellectual and emotional experience I get from other media. Okay, but that's what I get. I get something very similar to the feeling I get when I read a book or I watch a movie. And I've always thought about the games that I've worked on and the games that come out of this sort of simulation movement is too strong a word, but this simulation idea, I've always found them to be much more like dialogues. It's not about, I mean, I have a point of view, and Deus Ex and even, believe it or not, Disney Epic Mickey both express aspects of myself, but instead of telling people, here's what I think, I would much rather say, hey, what do you think about all this stuff? Hey, that's interesting. You know, here's my response to that. And that's what games like this can do. They can engage players in a dialogue in a way that only games can. And I just find that personally more interesting.
Let's see some questions. Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Should we hit mic out, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Following on that, viewing the experience of playing within a system as a conversation, I haven't always really equated seeing the designer in the work or having the designer be in control as a bad removal of my agency. Sometimes I like to know that a designer is present, and there's been a lot of powerful game moments that I've had that came from A, my control being taken away, and B, those moments within a working ecosystem where my experience was the same as other players. Do you think that there is room for an author's presence in an emergent design model, that sometimes the player can interact with the mind that made the game, or they can have a conversation with the creator that's generated that world?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself too much, but I think that, I mean, at some level, my personal ideology does come through in my work. I mean, it'd be disingenuous for me to say that my games are completely neutral and, you know, every player is able to take out of them what they want. I think, I mean, even a SimCity or a Sims, which seems like the sort of ultimate sandbox, is an expression of something that Will Wright wanted to say. And so I absolutely believe there's room for that. And again, as a player, I adored Heavy Rain. I mean, I just adored it. Hey, look, but that's, opinions are, you know, like, you know, we all have them, right? And The Walking Dead I thought was fantastic. Right now, I'm trying to figure out why Beyond Two Souls and The Wolf Among Us they're not quite working for me in the same way, but that's if one of you can answer that, I'd love to talk about that.
Well, you know that the two of the designers from The Walking Dead are speaking later today.
I know, and I can't wait.
Yeah, and I actually think there's a great, if you look at I think there's going to be a great subtext today about choice and strategy games, be and narrative. It's going to be a really good day. Yeah.
So isn't a bit the elephant in the room that the problem here is really that they're narrative games, because emergence already exists in simulation games and real-time strategy. So it's like, with all these problems, yes, there are other genres that deal with them, as you know, RPGs and adventure games. And I think that adventure games do a lot of the things that you've been talking about when you work in them. But the problem is that we want to frame them in narrative terms. We want players to have their narrative experience. And that is the key issue. It's not emergence. We know how emergence works, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, clearly there are genres of games where emergence is everywhere all the time. There's no question about that. I think emergence in simulation games and in sports games results in, okay, let me back up one step. I mean, I love stories. I live for stories, and I've just personally, I've gotten to the point where I'm not much interested as a player. Personally, not interested as a player in you know, Sims and other kinds of games like that. And I love stories, and I love storytelling, and I love the fact that we work in a medium that doesn't have to, but can tell stories in new and unique ways. And I'm also personally, I hate to personalize this so much, but I'm personally drawn to problems I don't know how to solve. I've worked on war games and board games, and if I wanted to, I could, I think, design a pretty decent, simulation of something, an RTS. I don't think it would be beyond my capabilities. I'm just not interested in doing it. And so this discussion is as personal as it is generalizable. I see a problem out there. It's one that I'm intensely interested in solving. I don't know how to solve it, and so I'm trying to convince other people to solve it for me, so I don't have to do all the heavy lifting myself. But you're right. Simulation and emergence exist in lots of areas of gameplay and game development. And we have another question. Sorry.
Hi. You had a slide early in your talk that looked like 3 sort of directed graphs of letters connected to each other in sort of a field of numbers. I'm wondering if that's some kind of design shorthand that you've developed for yourself, or if it was just clip art.
No, that was no. I used to have more data on a slide like that for another talk I gave, and it's just there are 3 or 4 different sort of mission structures that I've used in games that I've worked on, and that one happened to be Deus Ex. It was one of the flow charts for Deus Ex, and it wasn't that those were the only options. It was, we were very primitive at that point in our thinking, or I was very primitive in my thinking, and so what we did is we created a box. Each mission or location was a box, and there were specific points that we knew you had to get to. We didn't care how you got to them, but that was an expression of that idea that within each creative box, within Hong Kong, there were specific things that we were going to force you to do before you could make forward progress to the next box, and that was just an illustration of that.
So did you have like 3 dozen boxes, like in a file somewhere? Or?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. It was a very primitive game. Deus Ex was all smoke and mirrors, and to be honest, most games, not all smoke and mirrors. It was a lot smoke and mirrors, but very little of it was pre-planned. I will say that very, very, very little. And there were I think 2 points in that game that were specifically pre-planned because our story became more important than the player's experience, and I considered those 2 things failures. And before you ask me what they were, I remember one of them, but not the other. Anyway, but yeah, it was basically a bunch of boxes strung together. And the difference between what we were doing and what other people were doing at the time was we actually did have fairly large boxes that you could explore freely in whatever way you wanted. We cared that you got through a door, not how you got through it. But you were damn well going to get through that door, right? That was kind of the model for Deus Ex. And one more point, I hope. I am a full-time academic as of October 1st, but I've been told that full-time academics have time to do side projects, and now all the people in the front row are laughing at me. But my dream is actually to start a small indie side effort that will explore the idea of truly procedural narrative, because I'm a story guy, for better or worse.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I guess that segues pretty well. Dealing with narrative and emergence, you need emergent communication, and a lot of the talks seem to deal with emergent object behavior, but how do you deal with emergent communicative behavior? Maybe what I've seen do it well is something like Journey, where you let people have to figure out how to communicate with each other with a set of behaviors. But do you? What? Oh. But how would you apply your way of doing things towards emergent communicative to have a narrative develop that's not just a physical one?
Yeah, I tend to focus more on the physical because I can see ways to deal with it. That's a great question. And back in the day we used to talk about, oh man, once we get voice recognition and natural language processing and all that other stuff that is never going to happen, or not in my lifetime, think of the things we can do. Mostly what we do is pathetic, and write scripts that are this big, that factor in either everything we can think of, which is horrible and old school and stupid, or is generic enough that it doesn't draw you out of the experience. We write a lot of damn text and have a lot of voice acting, and it's a terrible answer, I admit it, but it's kind of the one I know. And given that you're right, most of this is geared towards the physical emergence, object interactions and AI interactions. We tend to craft contexts that exploit that and downplay our weaknesses. But again, that's the unsolvable problem that I have no idea how to solve, that I want to try to mess with next. And after that, I'm going to make a musical.
Go ahead next.
Okay, so I have a question, and I want to throw out a couple examples to try and clarify what I'm talking about. How much of a game system and a potential site for emergence and unpredictability in the experience would you say takes place like inside of a player's mind? And examples might be like, okay, if we're playing Risk and I adopt a very different goal that disrupts the game, like I'm king making or doing entirely the wrong thing, or the Olympic badminton players who were disqualified last year for just having the wrong intention, or speed runs and pacifist runs where people take a system that doesn't necessarily accommodate an emergent goal in code and do something really different with it, or even like the Telltale Games choices where they don't necessarily affect the system, but they maybe affect really how the player is responding to or understanding what's happening in the narrative.
Yeah, that's another great question. There are about 6 different answers to it as well, because you cited very different examples of breaking, using emergence to break games. And I think there are a variety of answers, since there are a variety of problems. On the one hand, you have to accommodate, you have to just accept that people are going to break your game. Like I said, I didn't get a chance to talk about my examples because I ran out of time, but here I'm going to get to do it anyway. We created a lot of systems thinking players would use them in a couple of specific ways, not planning the outcomes or the results, but thinking, oh man, if we did this, I can see players doing X, Y, and Z. And in fact, they did A, B, and C. Like we created, there were these characters called the Men in Black and Women in Black, Mibs and Wibs, we called them. And we designed them to explode when they died. They exploded when they died. And the goal was, my microphone is in appropriate position. The goal was, towards the end of the game when we introduced them, we wanted to ratchet up the difficulty because players were getting better at using the tools. And we didn't want them to get too close to the Mibs and Wibs. So that was what we expected. It was designed for a specific purpose. What players started doing is getting the wimpiest weapon in the world, which was the pistol, luring Mibs and Wibs over by locked doors and locked chests and everything, and putting one bullet in them and blowing them up. And that way not using up any of the resources that we had very carefully placed around our levels, to open the doors and get into the chests. I mean, that was an exploit that luckily didn't break the game. Now we had another one where I'm sure you've probably heard this story before, but we created these light attack munitions that you could stick to the walls. Have you heard about that? Do you know about this? All right, well, enough of you are not shaking your heads that I'm going to tell it anyway. They were physical objects. They had, collision and all that, and they had certain characteristics. They did explodey damage, but they didn't blow you up, okay? They only blew up enemies. And so what players did was they put one on a wall, jumped up on it, and then put one a little higher up and jumped up on it, and then reached down and grabbed the first one and put it up above that, and they created lamb ladders. And we did not see that coming. Luckily, it happened. One of our testers figured it out. And so what we did is we put crates and ladders outside of our game world, because when players, we said, hey, that's cool. Players found an exploit, they'll be able to get out of our maps. Neat. Again, it was a bug for anybody. It was a bug for us, but we just said, well, let them get back in the game, no problem. So there's emergence that breaks your game, but once a player buys the game, it's theirs. If they're having fun, I don't care. Just go make your own play. And then there's what happens in your head. That was the other one you mentioned, and I think that's crucially important. And I think it happens naturally. I don't think that's a breakage. I think that's inevitable. When you give players the opportunity to interact with the world the way they want to, they're going to bring so much more of themselves to it, because their options are so much less limited. So I think that's a plus that I wish I'd thought of. It's going in my slides if I ever give this talk again. I think the most powerful tool you have as a designer is what's going on between the player's ears, right?
All right, well, I apologize to all of the burning questions and the hands that I couldn't answer in the crowd. We're over time. Here's what we're going to do. First of all, let's thank Warren Spector for a really amazing talk. Thank you.